Hi, my name is Vasilisa. Welcome to my channel about brain research. I'm very thankful to you for watching this video. This episode will be about senses. We will talk with Professor Hervé Cadiou about the principle of communication between some stimulus and the nervous system. We will talk about smells or olfaction, which is the earliest type of sense formed in animals, and about magnetosensation, which is the latest. Magnetosensation is the ability to sense and to react to magnetic fields which our planet generates. And it is the latest type of senses not because of evolutionary reasons, but because researchers only recently have started to investigate this type of sense. And it is a quite provocative topic. Why? You will know from this episode. Enjoy, leave a comment, like, subscribe, have fun! Hello, Hervé.
Hello, Vasilisa. Thank you for inviting me. This is a great pleasure, actually. I really like to talk about magnetic field and perception and how the animals detect and perceive the magnetic field. And I have to say, I'm very pleased because you're a former student of the Joint Master, and it's always good to see a former student doing fantastic things. So.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So, Hervé, you are a biologist.
It's even a bit more complicated because actually I did a PhD in biophysics. Mm-hmm. So I'm not even a neuroscientist per se, and I'm sure that people around me, the hardcore neuroscience, the people who do brain slices all the time, and probably don't describe me as a pure neuroscientist because I train as a biophysicist. Mm-hmm. My PhD was on fish and to understand how they detect smell and odorant molecules. And you know that olfactory neurons have these cilia, these very fine cilia, which is very difficult to approach by standard patch clamp techniques. And so what people did at the time was basically to collect the cilia from the olfactory epithelium, and then you could use them to artificial lipid bilayers and study the properties of ion channel within this cilia. So I did a PhD studying ion channels responsible for olfactory transduction, basically. And then I did a postdoc in Cambridge to work mainly on nociception and pain. And then I got hooked on magnetoreception. And I think it's a very interesting story because at the time, this was in the year around 2005. This is a long time ago. Our project with nociception and pain was going fairly well in the lab. We had lots of result papers and we were applying for funding. And my Cambridge boss didn't have any doubt that we will get funding to pursue the work. I was working on acid sensing ion channels, so ion channels that are opened by a drop in pH. For example, in tissue acidosis and inflammation, you have ion channels opening because you have a drop in pH. When you have an inflammation, when you have bone cancer, etc., the pH of the extracellular medium is dropping tremendously.
Yes. Hervé, I'm sorry, may I ask you, because probably now some people who are not from biology or not from neuroscience, they can be confused a bit. What are ion channels?
Where ion channels? Okay.
And so why ion channels in neuroscience study them?
Okay. So ion channel. So basically, the cells are surrounded by a membrane made of fat, of lipids, and in order to communicate with the outside world, they are organized pore where ion can go through. And in fact, there's an equilibrium between ions between the outside and the inside the membrane. So you have lots of sodium outside the cell, like in the primitive ocean, and then you have little sodium inside the cell, and then you have a gradient of sodium. And then when the ion channels open, they trigger what we call, at least in excitable cells, an action potential, and the cells communicate, the neurons communicate through action potentials. It's an overshoot of voltage. It goes, so a resting potential of the neuron is typically minus 70 millivolts. And then when the cells are electrically excited, they go up to 30 millivolts and producing an action potential. And the signal is coded by the frequency of action potential. So ion channels are participating in either transmitting the signal or also detecting the signal. And that's probably important for what we will say later on. Is some ion channel, their openings are triggered by a mechanical stimulus, a thermal stimulus, a chemical stimulus, but some, and we're hoping to find, maybe a magnetic stimulus, but that we don't know yet. So ion channels are very important because not only they act as transmitting a signal, but they also detect stimulus in our outside world, either directly or indirectly. If I take my hand and give a knock on my hand, there's ion channel called piezo. They're going to open, triggering a receptor potential, and this receptor potential is going to trigger the generation of action potential. The action potential is going to travel along the nerves and then to my brain, where the signal is going to be processed. If I look in my nose, there are odorant receptor. They bind to odorant molecules, and then they trigger a signaling cascade, and this signaling cascade is going to open ion channels. Why I was talking about direct or indirect processes.
Coming back to your PhD with fish and olfactory cues, I think since fish live in water, for them it is very important, vitally important to understand chemical composition around them.
Yeah.
And could you please tell something about it?
Exactly. So the odorant molecules in fish are quite different from the one we can detect, because we detect volatile odorant molecules. So odorant molecules that are dispersed in the air, but they are lipophilic. Okay? Whereas fish detect soluble odorant molecules like amino acids. Amino acids, very powerful odorant molecules for fish. And there are some very interesting experiments where you take worms, you grind the worms, and you identify the composition of amino acids of these worms, and you put a mix of amino acids near a fish, and the fish will go through the amino acids, and you can restrict to one amino acid. I think it's alanine, where if you put a small drop of alanine in the water, the fish will swim towards it.
I know that during embryonic development of the child, the olfactory system emerges the first. So
yes, exactly.
So the understands it actually smells.
Yes. So that's very interesting, and that's a very fascinating topics because, and I worked on that like something 10, 12 years ago. It's actually the way we are exposed to odorant molecule, even in the womb, shape our olfactory receptor landscape. There are very interesting story where and studies where actually, so normally aniseeds, you know what aniseeds is?
Aniseeds, no.
Aniseeds. Let me, sorry. Anise. So this is
Anise, like a spice.
Yeah. Yes, aniseed. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, like that, exactly the spice. So generally, newborn babies are adverse to it. So if you put a drop of anise smell to their lips, they will, make a kind of funny face. They don't like it. They will, wow. They will, they will, they will. If they could talk, they will say yes. But if you tell the mom to take anise when they're pregnant, and you present the smell to the baby, they will like it.
Very interesting.
That's the same with garlic. There are also some very old publication where it's in the south of France. I really like garlic. And so a typical dish is called aioli. And basically, it's a mayonnaise with lots of garlic. And in the south of France, they eat lots of aioli. And when you like, yeah. Let's stop the debate about garlic. Garlic is fine. I love garlic. I'm French. So if you present the garlic smell to newborn babies in Paris, where they don't eat much garlic, they really ate it. But if you present garlic smell to the babies in the south of France, they will actually love it. So that means that not only the odorant receptor landscape is shaped during the womb, but also our olfactory preferences. So that's quite fascinating. But yeah, you're right. So there are many interesting things about the olfactory sense because it's a very, as you say, it's a very primitive sense. It's very easy to build a nose. It's a bit more complicated to build an eye. We in the lab, we work on planarian, and they have, we don't call it eye, but we call eye spot because it doesn't form an image. So they basically see where the direction of the light, but they can't really see, as I see your face, for example. But they have a very good sense of smell. And in fact, the sense of smell is very primitive sense, very easy to build. You need a few receptors and a very simple transaction cascade, and also a very simple track to have a reaction from it. Whereas forming an image, it's something a bit more, it's trickier, really. And to prove that it's really, olfaction and the olfactory sense is important. It doesn't go, so the thalamus is not the first relay of the information for the olfactory sense. The olfactory tract, we're not going to go into detail too much, but it goes to the memory areas, yes, as well as directly to the, sorry, the English is, is going to the trunk directly. Then you can puke. If there's an adverse smell, then you can puke. So you have a direct reflex with the cerebral trunk.
In this case, this olfactory system is very peculiar because all other senses that we have, like when we understand some painful stimulus,
exactly, or
auditory signals or visual signals, all these signals go to thalamus, and this is the
thalamus, yeah,
brain.
and not the olfactory one. It's a
Yes,
very
with exception for the olfactory system.
Yeah, it goes through. It's strongly connected to memory, so the hippocampus, strongly connected to the hypothalamus as well, because for all the reproduction. For the hormones and reproductive signals, there are some very direct connections to it, because olfactory is probably the most important sense for your survival. If you're
survival, for understanding the environment and for understanding of your behavior, for example, for the reproduction.
Exactly. It's very simple to sense. It's very simple to sense a mate, for example, to sense for food with an olfactory system. Going onto a visual system, it's a bit more complicated. You need a bit more a brain power, actually. Something we do, but the olfactory system is certainly, in a way, more efficient at doing those things.
Many years ago, when I was adolescent and I wanted to study neuroscience, so it was many years ago. I watched
when you joined the Joint Master.
I watched a French film. It's called Body in Love. This is a great film because there people explain how humans fell in love. Actually starting from pheromones, from sensing odors of each other, and actually body and brain, they do a great work in understanding the partnership between two humans.
Believe it or not, it's highly controversial and not always verified by science. The idea of a pheromonal communication in humans so far hasn't been proven. And this is a very interesting story because so you probably know that, so to put it that way, generally the average mammal are very good sniffer. So we have a very good sense of smell. And so we have developed different olfactory subsystems. I'm not going to go through them all, but we have the main olfactory epithelium. So the main olfactory epithelium detects like food smell or general odorant molecules. And then we have something called the vomeronasal organ. And the vomeronasal organ is a little tube within the nasal septum. And these little tube, so it's what one would call a cul-de-sac. It does have only one opening. So you need a kind of pump mechanism to be able to pump the odorant molecules into it. And that's a reason why if you see horses in the field, have you seen horses doing, I mean, sorry for the imitation, but they do that sort of thing. They purse their lips, and it's when they activate the pump and they draw odorant molecules into the vomeronasal organ. They don't smile. They have sense of female, basically. And so these vomeronasal organ, which are little tube, you have specialized olfactory neurons to detect pheromones. Okay? And what we see is that in most mammals, you have vomeronasal organ. You have vomeronasal organ in reptile as well. But there's something interesting, and it's where evolution sometimes is also to be considered in terms of neuroscience. The brain can't do both. So basically, you can't have a very good sense of vision and a very good sense of smell.
So brain specializes on something.
Yes. So the brain has to be specialized on something when you consider vision and olfaction. And for example, if you take birds, so the vermonasal organ, the presence of a vermonasal organ indicates a very strong sense of smell. So if you're a good sniffer, you're gonna have a vermonasal organ. When olfaction is not that important for you and you are more of a visual animal like us, the vermonasal organ tend to disappear. And in human, humans are a bit of an exception in mammals because they have a good vision, even a very good vision. Nothing compared to birds, but they have a very good vision. We see colors. Lots of mammals don't see colors. So we see colors, we see from far, we see a bit of dim light, etc., etc. And the fact is, it is more than belief, because we have evidence of that the vermonasal organ is not always present in adulthood. So we can find a little tube in neonates, but in adults, you don't always find it, and it's not functional. So the organ responsible for pheromone detection doesn't work in humans. It's not functional. So
we've just crushed
wait for it.
Very important and famous myths.
Okay.
Do you understand it now?
I'm gonna come back on this. It's not all black. It's not all black. So put it that way, pheromonal communication in human, no, probably no. And you have to understand that pheromonal communication is very powerful. If you look at hamster, so there's a pheromone in hamster called aphrodisine. And basically you put a little stick with aphrodisine on the stick, and then the male hamster is going to hump the stick. So what you have to understand is that pheromones induce a very particular behavior. And in human, no one has seen that. There's not a magical substance that you put on a stick and then, we're going to rush on the stick.
At least not yet.
Not yet. Not yet. And it's even more complex than that, because I think if you look at mice, for example, every step of the courtship is under the control of a different pheromone. And there's one which comes to my mind. Pride and Prejudice, the book. In the book, there's a guy, loved by the lady, and he's called Mr. Darcy. So,
like Mr. Darcy, of course.
Mr. Darcy, yeah.
Yes.
So there's a pheromone called a darcin, and when you put a bit of darcin, the female mice are in low doses.
Oh wow!
So pheromones are important, but then mice have a very developed sense of smell that we don't have. We rely more on visual cues for mating. Think about the Ferrari, the red car, and that sort of thing. However, there are some very troubling facts about olfaction and behavior in humans. For example, there's an interesting experiment where you put so there's a big sort of, in this psychophysics experiment, there's always a big classic, which is the T-shirt experiment. And basically, you're going to take T-shirts, clean T-shirts, which are devoid of smell, and you tell participants to wear them and doing a particular action. And then you will remove the t-shirt and tell to somebody else to smell the t-shirt. And they did this very, so it's 18 rated, but I'm sure we can talk about that. So basically you take a batch of male people, and one is gonna watch adventure movie, and is gonna watch an erotic movie. And of course they're wearing the t-shirt, and after they remove the t-shirt and you give the t-shirt to female participants. And the female participant much prefer the t-shirt worn by the guy who were looking at the erotic movie.
So this is a very controversial topic.
It's a very controversial topic. So there's probably not a pheromonal communication in terms of in the classical definition, but there's probably some stuff going on there.
Something remained in our brain that still helps us.
Probably. There's not such a thing like free will, in biology.
Yes.
But we all know that you're a scientist, free will doesn't exist.
This is science, yes. No,
this is science. Yeah, we're far from the magnetic field.
Very, but it was a very exciting actually discussion. We destroyed several myths, just like
we destroyed several
by passing our main topic.
and people are generally very disappointed and the students are very disappointing. And I'm starting some of my lecture by some adverts you can find on certain websites where they advertise for pheromones for young males who want to catch females, and then I just pop an advert for these kind of substance and say don't waste your money.
This is also helpful. So coming back to geomagnetic fields and navigation.
Okay, let's come back to
you are a member of Royal Institute of Navigation in the UK. Yeah. Also, I saw that you had some collaborations with NASA and space research.
Also,
you're a painter.
I'm a painter. Yes. Yes.
How it all happened in all your life?
I do all the things very badly.
I don't believe.
I try to do all these things, but we can probably plan for several sessions, I guess. So how I came to magnetic field is a very interesting story. So I was starting to say that my boss in Cambridge, we were working on pain and nociception, and then he knew someone, a friend of his family in New Zealand, working on magnetic field and perception of the magnetic field. And so one day he popped into my office in the morning and say, "Oh, Hervé, I have got a brilliant idea." And when you're a postdoc and your boss, walked in, and it's like, no.
Suspicious is happening, and I will be in charge.
Yes, that exactly that sort of thing. My boss got a crazy idea, I will have to implement it. And say, "Oh, Hervé, I had this brilliant idea, and why not we do a proposal on perception of magnetic field by animals?" Just look at that thing. I didn't know anything. I just watched, as anyone else, I watched a BBC documentary saying that animals could find their way in mysterious ways, maybe sometimes having a compass, but I thought this was a bit mystical. So I watched the literature, and I was very, very surprised to see that people were doing that kind of research in the 60s. Can you imagine that? The fact that animals have a magnetic sense was established in the 60s. There are some very interesting experiments that people were doing. in the 60s, there was a guy called Wolfgang, there's a guy, he's still alive, Wolfgang Virchow. And so when robins are ready to migrate, so soon they will go down south, and when they're ready to migrate, they will have something we call migratory restlessness. It has a German name, but I'm not going to pronounce it because I'm very bad at German.
Me too.
You know, there's things that I'm not good at. And basically, when you take these birds in the autumn and the fall, they will go south. So you take them in a small arena, and they will do scratch on the paper on the south side of the arena. And then if you change the magnetic field around the bird, it will go the other way. And that was done in the 60s. And people were really baffled by that. And of course, it has been reproduced a great number of times. And at the same time, a guy called Frank Brown, a circadian biologist, was doing experiments on planarians. And so planarians are flatworms, as we're actually studying in the lab. And these flatworms are very simple organisms, but they're very famous for regeneration. So we can cut them and they will regrow in, you can cut them in 30 pieces and you will have 30 worms in 2 weeks. They're champion of regeneration. And they do many fantastic things, but regeneration is one of their things. And Frank Brown using planarians so that they were using magnetic field to find their way also. But history only remembered Wolfgang Virchow for the discovery of the magnetic sense. And since then, people have been finding magnetic sense in all animals they looked at. I mean, recently there's been a bit of a trouble with reproducing experiment in Drosophila. So I hope maybe some people will refine the magnetic sense in Drosophila. But literally wherever you're looking at, birds, fish, mammals, even humans have a magnetic sense. And we can talk about that because this is also a very fascinating story. But the problem is finding a molecular explanation for this sense. And that was my boss idea. Of course, we didn't find it, and I'm still looking at it. Magnetoreception is a sort of curse because it doesn't bring you very far in terms of publications. This is a very hard area of research because you have to build everything by yourself. You have to understand magnetic fields. This is very prone to artifacts.
Pioneers in this field.
Mm-hmm.
So we can say that you are pioneers in this field.
Well, no, I'm not a pioneer. I've been trying to find something and trying to publish things forever almost. But no, we got a very good story with the planarian that we're hoping to submit very soon. And we published a paper last year about the origin of the magnetic sense, showing that, and that was published in PNAS last year. Showing that all organisms have this magnetic sense in terms of genetics. So this is very fascinating because you have a whole avenue of research. I mean, there have different hypotheses to explain how animal would sense a magnetic field, but so far there's no, I mean, people didn't manage to link a particular molecular explanation with a sense.
Because if we talk about senses and feelings, there is like an algorithm in how it works. So generally, you have some trigger. It could be visual trigger or audio, some kind of trigger. Then you have a receptor. So the organ that the first encounters this trigger.
Exactly.
Then from this receptor, this signal could be converted into
an electrical signal. And this is what sensory physiologists call transduction. That's what we
transduction.
We call transduction. The transduction is a principle of converting energy in your environment. So you're surrounded by energy, chemical energy, thermal energy, magnetic energy, electromagnetic
stimulus. So it could be different type of stimulus. So then we have this conversion. Then it becomes an electrical signal, and then this signal propagates through your nerves to your central nervous system, or
to your central nervous system, if you have one. If you have one,
yes. But since you told that actually each type of animals, even very primitive animals, have this reaction to magnetic fields. So it means that this system is very old and very.
It's probably very old, and the fact is, it's even older than you think, and that's very important. That's very interesting, because I have to tell you a story about this. There are organisms that we call magnetotactic bacteria, and these are fantastic organisms. I mean, bacteria in general, I'm an animal physiologist, but I found bacteria equally exciting. You have something called magnetotactic bacteria. The way they were discovered was amazing. There was a guy called Blackmore in the 70s, and he was collecting sediments from marshlands. He went back to his lab and put the sediment into big beaker. And he was at his desk working on the publication, and he noticed that, very strangely, there was some kind of cloud spinning in these beakers, and he was not too sure about what was going on. So he took this beaker and were moving from place to place in the lab, and he found out that actually, when you place this beaker close to rotating magnets, you could see this cloud of something spinning. Then he had the idea of putting a drop onto a microscope slide, and found out that you had little, almost like little bits, jumping in one direction. So they were all going to north. And then when he put these little bits onto the grid of a electron microscope, he saw bacteria with magnetite crystals inside. So what these bacteria are able to build is actually magnetic material. It's not something that they take in the environment, but they build a crystal of magnetic material, and each bacteria has a typical shape of crystals.
So which type of magnetic materials do they build? Is it something based on iron?
Yes, so they're making magnetite. So magnetite or lodestone is a naturally occurring magnetic material you can find in geological condition. But you can also find magnetite built by organism. It's an iron oxide, and it's naturally magnetic. It has a magnetic moment. But can you think about it? I mean, I think this is a very powerful idea. Little organisms that are less than a micrometer long can actually do nanotechnology. They're building a crystal with specific magnetic properties, something that we've just been, in terms of human history, we've just been able to do. This is fascinating. And
also, I worked in nanotechnology. I know how it is difficult to produce nanoparticles with specific magnetic properties.
Exactly, and you think that so it's under a tight genetic control, And so they are genes that are responsible for building, and we know these genes. And actually, we, in the last year paper, we were able to see, and detect these genes in higher organisms, so leaving the way for more in-depth research about the genes involved in magnetoreception. But I found it quite intriguing that small organism, what we would call primitive, I don't like this term, but we would call primitive, are able to build crystals with desired magnetic properties. And they use it to align in the direction of the magnetic field and to stay together. I mean, the way why they do this is not fully understood. I think maybe some microbiologists who are going to argue with me, but it's not that clear. Also because it's sometimes associated to other taxes, like there are bacteria which are called magnetoaerotactic or magnetophototactic. So there are two senses coupled together. And it's not very clear if it's a pure passive mechanism, which people think, or it's also a bit more active, and might be the case. But when you think about these organisms, they are able to build this magnetic material. I think this is.
I have a question. Where do these bacteria generally live?
Oh, almost everywhere. It's actually something you can do anyone can do. They're living in ponds and rivers. It's where you have some kind of, when leaves degrade and they leave this kind of fluffy sediment. So if you go in river and ponds, you don't want, pebbly, rocky bottom, but you want more sort of kind of fluffy sediment. So you can take some of this fluffy sediment, put in a jar, stick a magnet on the side, and in the night you will see a white pellet appearing. And this white pellet are the magnetotactic bacteria.
Great. So now we can use it to actually find them just at home.
Yeah. I can give you a very simple protocol in order to yes, sure. We can if in the link of the video, if you want, we can put a protocol to isolate the magnetotactic bacteria. If you have a simple microscope, it's good fun to play with them, actually, because then after you take the pellet and you put under a glass slide and you put under a microscope, and you can play with the magnet, and they will go in the direction dictated by the ambient magnetic field. So you're a bit like God to them.
So they not only produce magnetite, they also move in the direction of.
They more or less move or align in the direction of the field. So by playing with the magnet, you can move them around. It's very satisfying.
And planarias they also can move in the direction of magnetic fields, right?
Well, it's where it's not that clear if it's a purely passive or active mechanism.
So if they want, they move.
Well, dictated by the ambient field, yes.
Okay, great. And birds. As far as I know, that birds during their migration, they use different cues like olfactory cues, visual cues, and also magnetic fields. Because
you're talking about birds.
Places of the planet, these fields different, and that helps birds to understand the position.
Yes. So birds use different cues to orient and navigate. They can use the stars. So basically, you can do experiments in a planetarium, for example, where you have, some kind of movie theater where you show a picture of the sky And you can do experiment where you can put birds in these little M-length funnels. And if you change the starry night, if you change the position of the star, they will go in the other way. Lots of, especially small birds, travel at night because you don't have predator and because the weather conditions are better.
Mm-hmm.
So lots of birds travel with the night sky. They use visual cues like the position of the sun, the position of the road. I mean, pigeons. I have many pigeon stories to tell you about. The the pigeons. They're fascinating.
It could be a name of the book, like, you know.
They're fascinating animals, despite what people might think about pigeons. You know, we often see pigeons as flying rats, but they're rather smart birds, I have to say. When you understand you try to understand their navigation abilities. And so pigeons can they can memorize the position of the roads or railway tracks or visual cues, etc. Some people have a decent sense of smell. I mean, like, for example, marine birds. So marine birds are not crappy sniffer. They can actually detect at 100 kilometers away a piece of rotting squid. So they're not that bad. But generally, birds are not very good sniffer. Marine birds are not too bad. And kiwi is a super sniffer. The kiwi bird.
Did any researchers in the field of magnetosensation, did they study the brain of birds, for example,
Yes.
for the presence of magnetite? Since this is the compound.
And I was also involved in it, and that has been a controversial issue because it was initially thought, I mean, the search for magnetite, and there's another mechanism that we can discuss later on, but the search for magnetite has been terribly complicated because magnetite can be nowhere and everywhere. Magnetite can be a contamination from the environment, so you have to be super, super, super cautious when you actually process biological sample. It's almost drive you to the paranoia, because you don't want to have any ion in the lab and you rinse everything with HCl. It really drives you mad when you look for magnetite because you try to be super, super cautious. I mean, lab equipments are made of iron, so they can bring contaminations. And so it's a very crazy story, crazy matter when you're trying to. And so in the year 2000, a group of German researchers found that the beak of the pigeon, they could find magnetite. And some people were saying yes, some people were saying no. And in 2012, we published a Nature paper with, so that was a work mainly done by David Keyes, which I was involved in. And we revisited the samples. And so actually, because in the Fleister paper, they were claiming that magnetite colocalized in the beak with a neuronal marker. So there are specific proteins that are expressed by neurons that you can detect using antibodies. And the Fleister claimed that these magnetite, and the magnetite they saw was colocalized with this neuronal marker. And when we revisited the work with lots of samples, we didn't find this colocalization. We found that the magnetite or the iron deposits was colocalizing with macrophage. And in fact, iron is very important for macrophages in all sorts of detoxifying process. So we didn't find the colocalization. And since the research has been a bit, in standby, and people have been looking for magnetite in the skull, in the beak, in the ear, and the problem of the magnetoreception area, I have to say, is that people were too fixated on birds.
Mm-hmm.
And why I'm saying that is, so birds are already, I mean, from a molecular biologist, they are big animals.
It's very difficult to.
It sounds weird. It sounds weird, but they are big animals. And if you consider the fact is that, you know, having eye in front of your in front of the animal is something important, and also light is not going to cross the tissue, so you're not going to have photoreceptor in your gut, for example. So you know where to look at, no pun intended, if you want to study vision. You know, you go to the eye. Where do you go if you study magnetoreception? You know, your body is permeable to magnetic field. So there's no reason why, you know, magnetoreception, I mean, magnetosensitive cells could be within anywhere in your body. I mean, some researchers are linking magnetoreceptor with the eye, and they're linking to a photochemical process called the radical pair mechanism, and something linked with a protein called cryptochrome. So there are these two big hypotheses in the field where either it would be magnetite, but so far the research for magnetite, the direct evidence for magnetite has been difficult to obtain. And on the other end, you have this cryptochrome story. And of course, if you disable, if you disable cryptochrome, the animals are not sensitive again, are not sensitive to magnetic field, which is to prove that point.
Just to prove, yes.
But the problem is that cryptochromes are also involved in circadian timing. So by disabling cryptochrome, you could just tell the animal to go and go to bed, for example, and sleep. So it's a complicated matter. It's a complicated matter. And there's also this hypothesis. It's a very old hypothesis, but has been revived recently, where you could sense the magnetic field using electric induction. So you know that some animals are electrosensitive. So sharks, for example, are able to detect tiny electric current in the sea.
Great.
And there are some hypotheses that, if you detect electric field, we're not going to go deep into the physics, but if you detect electric field in a conducting media, you can detect magnetic field through what we call an induction process. And actually, there are some evidence in pigeon ears that this process might happen. So, nobody is sure about this magnetoreception molecular mechanism. And to make it worse, and that probably we should have started to that with that items, is that magnetic field, in fact, you have different parameters of the magnetic field. And as you rightly put in your nice introduction, the core is generating the main field, the main magnetic field. So basically, the Earth has got this core, it's spinning around, and it's generating what we call the main field. Okay, and so the main field has so it has north close to the geographic north, but the force field line are joining the two poles, like in a semicircular pattern. In undergrad or in college, you're doing these experiment where you put a magnet and you put iron filing, and you see these lines joining the two poles. And the same, but these has a very interesting consequence about the magnetic field. And at the equator of the Earth, the magnetic field is parallel to the surface. But as you move close to the pole, the inclination is pointing towards the ground. And in Strasbourg, for example, there's a 63-degree inclination, whereas at the equator, it's almost parallel to the surface. And we were talking about birds, and birds are very good at detecting these inclination, and they have what we call an inclination compass. But there are other parameters of the magnetic field. One important parameter is the intensity of the magnetic field. So the magnetic field of the Earth is rather small. It's about 30 microtesla at the equator and 60 microtesla towards the pole. There's a contribution of the main field, but you probably know that on the crust of the Earth, there's magnetic material, and so these add to the main field and produce a crustal field. And this is interesting, and this is also interesting in terms of other worlds, and that's the reason why I'm also interested in space, because soon we'll colonize other worlds, and other worlds don't have the same magnetic field. If you take Venus or Mars, they don't have a main field. They don't have a core well, they have a core, but it doesn't produce these magnetic field. Mars has a very strong crustal field, but it's all disorganized. And I mean, the fact that we have a magnetic field, the main effect on living organism is deflecting solar radiations. So you probably know that the sun, of course, is giving us photons, which is useful for life, but is also sending us some very nasty particles, some high energy proton nuclei. And if it hits organic matter, it will produce, it will break it.
It will destroy, yes.
It will destroy. So the magnetic field deflect these particles. Not always, if you have what we call a solar storm, these solar storms are going to produce a lot of magnetic field and also lots of particles. And some particles can eat the Earth or the atmosphere, and it produces these auroras that we see sometimes from time to time.
So it is very interesting. If we leave our planet and if we go, I don't know, to other spaces.
To Mars. I hope we'll go to Mars.
Field. Yes, and we can take, like, for example, astronauts as an example.
Yes. So we have taken astronauts outside the magnetosphere. So Apollo astronauts went beyond the magnetosphere. And this is where it becomes interesting, because especially if you look at the media, space radiations are going to kill us. And actually, if you look at NASA Archive or Roscosmos or other space agencies, it's not that bad. They evaluate the risk, the radiation risk, after smoking half a packet of cigarettes per day, which this is without countermeasures, okay? Which is not that bad. It's a risk, but it's not that bad, and you can always take more antioxidants. Now there are countermeasures. You can put a magnetic field around and a solution that some colleagues and I are working on is putting a magnetic field around the craft, and then you can deflect the magnetic field. But so the absence of magnetic field, okay, the magnetic field is deflecting these particles, and it's protecting us, it protects our DNA. But then there are more intriguing we have more intriguing link to the magnetic field of the Earth. So of course I've described orientation, and this is one. Animals need the magnetic field to orient, but there are other phenomenon type which are linked to the magnetic field.
One is circadian rhythm. Actually, if you change the magnetic field around a living organism, you will see a phase shift. And so basically the way it works is most organisms are set on a 24-hour period. So you wake up in the morning, or we all try, and
Not always. Yes.
with 3 or 4 coffee works. And then we go to bed at night and we try to sleep. So we all do these things which are regulated by what we call a master clock, which is a suprachiasmatic nucleus. And this clock needs to be reset periodically, otherwise it goes crazy. It's sort of you lose your timing. If I put you in a cave in the dark, you will lose your biological rhythm. So light act as a synchronizer for this clock. That's the reason why is that staying on your computer late at night is not a very good idea, because you get lots of blue light, and blue light is,
and it confuses the brain.
It confuses the brain, exactly. And there are very old hypotheses that the magnetic field can act as a synchronizer too, and seems to have some good evidence about it, and we'll look at that. There is also some evidence that the magnetic field, the geomagnetic field, is involved in pain and nociception, and this is a very intriguing story. Because
I actually agree on this, because you can meet different discussions about this, about magnetic storms on the sun, and that people start to have a headache and feel pain somewhere.
There is some link with geomagnetic storm and health effect, and this is an emerging literature about it, stroke and geomagnetic storm. But there is some very intriguing story about a series of papers done by Prato a while ago, that they took mice and 2 hours per day, and they're putting the mice in a shielded environment. So 2 hours a day, they have no magnetic field at all. So you can build specific chambers, and we have in the lab, where the mice are deprived of magnetic field. And strangely, they have this analgesic effect. Nobody knows why, but, it's very interesting. It's also very interesting because that we have problem with opioids. There's an opioids crisis. So generally, analgesic and antinociceptive drugs, they're doing their jobs, but they have some strong side effects. If you talk about morphine and its derivative, it's a big problem. It's a huge problem in the US. So the more non-pharmacological interventions you can find for pain, especially chronic pain, this is good. So I'm trying to look at that in the lab using planarians, because planarians probably they're quite sensitive to magnetic field, and they have a very simple nervous system, more than the mice.
I have a last question. This is so sad that we have to.
But we can plan a second session, right?
Yes, we can do it easily, with pleasure. If you can, I'm always.
Oh, yeah.
So the question is that we produce, we humans, we produce different magnetic fields with our devices at home, the office, and so on. Do this technogenic
this is a very vast question.
On birds or on nature? What's happening?
So this is a very vast question. I think it's going to be difficult to answer in a short time, but basically, I think we can split the question into, so do electromagnetic radiation, like the one received by the public, have some, and I'm talking about health effect, sanitary effect? The answer is probably not. Biological effect, maybe yes, but it's very difficult to look at the studies, because some studies are not very carefully done. But so basically, health effect, I mean, we know that those which start to cause problems. So generally, I mean, with our device, everything is calculated for the member of the public. I'm not talking about the professionals. This is a different kind of dosimetry. But for member of the public, the doses are calculated that they're not going to cause any thermal effect. So health effect, this is biological effect. This is a complicated and muddy area, but interestingly, and it's where it gets interesting, and people don't think about that, but actually 50 hertz of the your electric cable does have some effect on, for example, melatonin production and so on. So 50 hertz have some well-documented biological effect. Radio frequencies like the one in your Wi-Fi, not that much. However, when we looked at, for example, magnetoreception in animals, and I was talking about robins, if you take robins in an urban area, they're confused by the electro smog to find their direction. So they'll probably have to use other cues. And there was a very interesting studies done almost 10 years ago by Engels, so the Moritzen lab. They were very frustrated because when they wanted to reproduce what the Wilsco had done, and they couldn't do it. And they were doing it on the campus, so in the middle of the town, and they had really some problem to reproduce the data. And then they put the birds into the countryside, and they had a very good orientation effect. And they found out that the electro smog was actually probably disturbing the birds into finding their way. I mean, having said that, birds don't rely on one cue. So if they're confused with a magnetic field, they can use station, for example.
This is great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this.
To conclude, what we all know, that we feel magnetic fields. That actually.
Okay, so does human detect magnetic field? That's a good question. I think we can probably talk next time, because this is also a very controversial issue.
Yes, let's discuss it the next time.